All right, I'm excited to show you this laboratory data. We're in section 4 here of energy requirements for exercise, our third module. So we're going to show you some data from the lab at rest and during exercise, and even show you what we call a VO2 max test. Some of you may have done these tests in labs when you were a student. What you should see in your down below this video is you should see associated files that you can download if you're curious and want to see these files and print them out. I've got those available for you for download if you're interested. So I want to show you, set this up. This is a resting metabolic rate test. This is where we had our subject just come in, lie down for 30 minutes. We hooked him up to the metabolic cart and we measured his oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide production. I want to run you through some of the variables here that we can measure. So let's just start. We got a 23-year-old male. He's 71 inches and he's 206 pounds. So this is a guy. And what you see here, these variables are, here's time, here's oxygen consumption in liters per minute. Okay, so the amount of oxygen he's consuming in liters per minute. Here's how much oxygen is consumed per kilogram of body weight. Usually this is how when we look at tests, this is what we really look at, is how much oxygen they're consuming per milliliter of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. At rest, resting is somewhere around 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And you can see he's somewhere in there. There's 3.4, there's 2.6, there's 3.0. And if you download the rest of this, because I can't show you all this here, you'll see that he's somewhere around 3.5. And that leads to our next variable here, which is METs. MET stands for metabolic equivalent. It's basically the relationship to rest. If one MET is actually rest, and that's why you're seeing the 0.8s and the 0.9s and the 1.0s here. If we got up to a MET level of 10, that would mean he's exercising 10 times rest. And if you multiplied that times 3.5, that would come up to be 35 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute. MET's just basically a way to describe intensity. And so here's volume of carbon dioxide. Here's VE, ventilation, which is how much air in liters the subject's moving in and out. Here's respiratory rate, and this is in breaths per minute. And this looks pretty good because at rest, typically we breathe about 12 breaths per minute. So this is pretty average, pretty normal here. Here's another reason why I wanted to show you the data. We have a variable here called RQ, respiratory quotient, or sometimes it's called RAR. And there's a technical difference, but for us, we're just going to use them synonymously here, where this can tell us the percent of carbohydrate and fat the individual is using. And this is really interesting. What we know is that if you have an RQ of 1.0 or greater, that means you're burning 100% carbohydrate. If you've got an R of 0.7 or less, that means you're burning 100% fat. And if you were, say, if you had an RQ of 0.85, that would mean that you're burning 50% fat and 50% carbohydrate. And we don't have to guess anymore. I used to have my students figure out the math on this. Now the metabolic cart will do this for you, and that's what you see here, percent carbohydrate and percent fat. And we'll come back to this. This is the actual number of calories they burned during the subject burned during the experiment. And you can see as you look at the download that it goes all the way down to the end of this 30 minutes. And then energy expenditure. How many calories is he burning per minute? And let me go ahead and I'll throw this out there. This is why a lot of people get depressed when they look, especially weight loss. Because you look at this, you got a 206-pound man, and he's only burning like 1.1 to 1.3, and here up you see 1.5, but in general about 1.1 to 1.2 calories per minute. We just don't burn as many calories as we think we do. That's a calorie a minute. That's 60 calories an hour, right? We just don't burn that many calories. And the cart's pretty smart. We can, I used to have my students hand calculate this, but now it tells us, it gives us an average. The metabolic cart in general is pretty cool because what it can do is I can set the data so that it records every minute, every 30 seconds, every 15 seconds. And so, for instance, like with 15 seconds, what it would do is it would take every breath that person breathes in that 15-second period, and it would collapse it. Just like this, you get every minute. And so every breath that this guy breathes, within that first minute, it collapses it and averages the data. And that's pretty cool. You could even do it and get data breath by breath, but what that would do is you would have so much data to print out, you would waste a lot of paper. So we typically don't do that. So when we start looking at this data from this individual, one of the things I want you to note is the RQ. And I don't have all the data here. I don't have all 30 minutes on this particular slide, but just look at this. So initially he starts out and it looks like he's burned 100% carbohydrate. But then as he begins to become rested, look what happens to his fat burning. He is an incredible fat burner. And in my live sessions, I really quiz my participants on this because I want them to think, why would this 206-pound male be burning so much fat? Because you're looking at this, and there's no such thing as burning 132% fat. You just can't do that. But that's pretty much 100% fat. Why would this guy be burning 100% fat? And I hear things like, well, he came into the lab fasted. And this is true because, well, we always require students and subjects to come into the lab pretty much fasted before they're testing. You don't want them to eat right before, right? But that's not the reason. Basically, if we go to this next slide, which you should also have in your downloads, this is the graphical report, which kind of shows and breaks down things even better than the text data. What I did is I threw the first 5 minutes out, and I threw the last 5 minutes out, as I said, and I just selected this middle portion, and that's why you see the duration is about 20 minutes here. With the MET level of 1.0, this is really normal. RQ of 0.71. So that means, and I've got it over here, he's burning 98% fat. Why would this guy be burning 98% fat? Think about that. I'll come back to it in a second. This is what we're also really interested in, is the calories per day. When you look at the number of calories he's burning per day, it's about 2,000, 1976. If you want to round that up to 2,000, that's good. And so this is one of the reasons why you would want to have somebody come into the lab, is so you could really get a gold standard measurement of their energy expenditure. We'll talk about later why you don't necessarily have to do this. Sometimes it's really a good thing. To give you an example of other people that I've tested, I had one mother bring her daughter in to test, and she was gaining weight and was having trouble and wasn't sure exactly what was going on. And she was a teenage girl, probably 16 years old or so at the time, maybe 17, and her metabolic rate was 700. Really, really low. Well, it turns out, and I knew something was going on. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it ended up that she had some kind of rare cancer. And so she went on to got that diagnosed, and she's battling that now. But sometimes there are reasons to test, and there's consequences that come out of the test that you really can't predict. Anyway, all right, so if we come back to this, anybody figured out why this person's burning 98% fat? And because this is a video recording, I can't see you face to face, but the reason that this individual was burning 98% fat is that they were on a low carbohydrate diet. They were eating a high fat diet. This individual was eating about 60-70% of his calories. He was a competitive not competitive. He was a amateur, I guess I should say, novice bodybuilder. Maybe you consider him that. And he was working through his diet, and he was working and changing it up. And I don't know how long he'd actually been on this high fat approach. As you can see, he's burning 98% fat, which brings up a good point, is that your body is pretty smart. It's going to use what you feed it. And so if you're feeding it fat, it's going to use that fat for fuel, right? It really is. So interesting. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to show this data to you, because oftentimes you don't get to see this type of thing. 98% of his calories were coming from fat, but he was eating, a majority of his calories from fat. So some of the discussion questions here around this: what happened during the first few minutes of his resting metabolic rate test? If you look at those first couple of minutes, it looks as if he's burning a lot of carbohydrates. But really the reason for that his RQ was so high was that he was nervous and he was over-breathing excess carbon dioxide. And so he was breathing out excess carbon dioxide, and so that led to this misconception, the numbers being skewed, if you will, and high. But once he settled down, you really started to see that he was burning a lot of fat. And so what is RQ and why is it important? RQ determines carbohydrate and fat utilization. And it's important because you can tell a lot of different things about your diet, whether it be from at rest or during exercise. And sometimes you might want to know those types of things. And what do the results say about his ability to burn carbs and fat for fuel? Well, he's definitely a big fat burner. The conclusions about his diet is he's eating a high-fat diet, 60 to 70% of his calories from fat. And how close was this to as predicted? We're not there yet, but we're going to. We're going to predict his metabolic rate using a variety of different equations. But before we get there, I want to show you a couple of other data reports. Here's one on a fella who's 35 years old. This guy was not fit, but we had him in our lab and wanted to do a test on him, and he was game enough to give it a shot. He's 245 pounds, so he is not an aerobic athlete. But we put him on the treadmill and ran him to max. So this is an exercise test, right? This is not a resting test, but an exercise test. And he is not very fit because if you look at his VO2 max, it's 31 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That's really kind of low. That's really low. And we know that if your cardiovascular fitness is low, then your risk of disease is actually high. And it's pretty easy to see that this guy, he's 245 pounds, right? He's 5'9". Definitely some body composition issues. What we had him do is he was probably, if you look here within the first couple of minutes, I'm guessing he was probably walking here really slowly. And then we bumped him up to 4 miles an hour and then this is not how you would traditionally do an exercise test, especially if it's somebody that's fit. 4 miles an hour, 6 miles an hour, and we added 2% grade here. If we look at the data and kind of, let's just take a look at the RQ or the RAR here. We've got RAR. He was burning mainly fat here. It must have been really a slow walk. And then as we bumped him up to 4 miles an hour, you can start to see, okay, towards the end of that, started to increase carbohydrate utilization. And just this goes along with the previous module towards the end where we talked about the fact as you start increasing exercise intensity, you're going to start to shift more to those carbohydrates and those anaerobic energy sources. That's what starts to happen here as you progress up to, where he fatigues at 6 miles an hour and 2% grade. Remember, 6 miles an hour is not that fast. It's only like a 10-minute per mile pace. Yet this guy was fatiguing it at 10-minute per mile pace, or 6 miles an hour, with a max MET level of somewhere around 9. And this just shows you the fat and carbohydrates. So by the time he got to the end of this 6 miles an hour, he was using all carbohydrate, those anaerobic energy sources for fuel. And he worked pretty hard because if you look at his max heart rate, it was 187. For a 35-year-old guy, that's pretty good. And then he was burning 18 calories a minute. Wouldn't that be nice? But this is during maximal exercise. This is where he was fatiguing. And to give you a relationship here, 31 milliliters per kilogram per minute, the highest recorded VO2 max was from a Norwegian cross-country skier, and his max was in the 90s. Okay, his max was in the 90s. If you were to test Lance Armstrong, his would have probably been, I think, in like the mid-80s or upper 80s. It does depend. Typically, you're going to have a higher VO2 max in running activities versus, say, cycling because you've got more muscle mass moving. The more muscle mass you've got moving, the more calories you're going to be burning, and the higher your max. So typically the cycling is usually 10% less or so than a treadmill run, unless you've got someone and that's their thing is cycling, like a Lance Armstrong. Then you can get a really high VO2 max on the bike. Just to finish up, I wanted to show you this data, and I cut off the top part so we can fit it all on there. This is a great subject that we had in the lab, and I love young, healthy, fit subjects because they give you great data for sure. This guy was in his 20s. I think he used to run cross country in high school, but since in college he hasn't been active. But if you look at his max, it's 55 milliliters per kilogram per minute, which is pretty good. If you look at a norm chart, that's going to be superior. That's going to be really pretty fit. His MET level, is around 15 to 16 METs, which really is really good as well. If you look at his RER and look at this nice progression, he's at 0.84, 0.89, 0.90. So he's starting to burn more and more carbohydrate as the intensity increases till eventually he starts to use all carbohydrates, and then he fatigues at an RER of 1.13. Again, here at about 9 minutes is where he really started to burn all carbohydrates. Let's see if we look over. This just shows you percent fat, percent carbohydrate. The heart rate also increases really incrementally, really gradually, really nice. 158, 160, 168, 170, mid-70s, 180, 189. Then he fatigues at 196 beats a minute. So this guy's running pretty hard. Maximal effort for sure. And then look at the speed and grade. I probably started him out too slow. I started him out at 5.5 miles an hour and no grade. I probably could have started him at 6. That would have, and that's what you try to do when you set up these protocols. As you go through, I'm looking at, let's see if I can find 9 minutes here. He's at 9 miles an hour and 0% grade is when he really started to burn all carbohydrates. And then he fatigued at 9 miles an hour and 6% grade, which is pretty impressive. So that's total calories during that 12 minutes was 186. That's pretty good, but he was working really, really hard towards the end. So I just wanted to show you this data because, like I said, a lot of times we don't get a chance to see this. And you guys don't get a chance to see this, and it can be very useful for training purposes. If you're especially if, for example, you're working with endurance athletes, you can tell, and we could, I'm not going to. It's beyond this module, beyond this course, but you can go through this data to look to see at what heart rates the subject needs to be training at to improve his lactate threshold or his ability to buffer that lactic acid that's being produced and get rid of it. There's just a lot of different ways you can use this data to improve athletic performance, in particular for endurance athletes. But even at rest, like we've shown here, it's nice to be able to look at the fuel utilization of athletes to kind of take a look at their diets and how that's reflected in the metabolic cart. And ultimately, for us, for interest in this course, we're talking about what the resting energy expenditure is. Because remember, this is only part of the equation. We then would also have to look at, with our athlete or with our bodybuilder who came in at 2,000 calories, we would still have to add in the thermal effect of food, and we would have to add in the number of calories he burned through exercise to give him the number of calories he needs to eat per day. With that, we'll finish this section up, and we'll look forward to seeing in section 5 where we start looking at how we estimate energy expenditure, and we'll get into some of those equations here to estimate energy expenditure in our next section.